We're here to talk a little bit about the future of our mobility and the proliferation of electric vehicles. Thank you for being with me this morning. Of course, transportation in developed countries is seen to be responsible for maybe about a third of all CO2 emissions. With electric vehicles, yes, CO2 emissions are reduced, but don't the electric vehicles still emit carbon through the manufacturing process and also from the fossil fuels used to generate the electricity they need to recharge?
Yes, they do. And the sort of myth busting, if you will, a little bit. Look, 15 years ago, when I started developing the Nissan Leaf, then very clearly it was all about zero emissions, and the drive was basically to get rid of the tailpipe. And that was coming partially because of the growing emphasis on CO2 generally, but also, of course, the general emphasis around clean air and getting particulates out of the air. So an electric car is very, very efficient at taking particulates out of the air because it doesn't emit CO2 from the vehicle itself. But it would be incorrect to say that it's net carbon zero, because it's not. And it's true that a lot of CO2 today is produced in the production of the vehicle and the battery. And we need to start thinking about not zero emission, but net zero carbon. Now, over time, even an electric car is better than let's say a diesel car from an overall CO2. But what you've got to do is you've got to take the CO2 out of the manufacturing process of both the car and the battery. And of course, you've got to take CO2 out of the charging process, which means basically the use of green electrons rather than electrons which have been generated from oil or gas. By the way, the same is absolutely true of hydrogen vehicles, which of course is the alternative, or one of the alternative technologies. Today, 99% of hydrogen is grey, and which basically is a side product of the oil and gas industry. So it equally has its sort of dirty underbelly that people don't always want to talk about.
On batteries and the cost of batteries, I saw that you discussed once the possibility of a subscription model for batteries. Is that viable, whereby you don't change the car but you change the battery as it's been used and it's no longer efficient?
One of the great parts of being in an industry in change is that there are lots of different models being explored. So you have the obvious one, which is a copy of an internal combustion engine, where you sell the customer the car and the battery. The battery is useful in the car until about 20% of its capability is diminished. So somewhere between 6 and 10 years. And then the battery would normally go into a second life, for example, as a energy storage capability out of a windmill, and a third life, which would normally be basically recycling, taking it down back to black matter. So that's the sort of traditional model. But you can have the other extreme model would be something like the battery swap capability, where you don't own the battery at all, and basically when you need to recharge your battery, you drive into a station and they swap the battery out. That was tried in Israel, a company called Better Place. It didn't work. Doesn't necessarily mean it won't work in the future. And certainly I would say the intermediary solution is basically you buy the car and rent the battery. And that takes away any of the residual risks associated with ownership of the battery. And we do see that gaining some momentum. And in particular, I would say in transport providers for buses, which is obviously an area of business that I'm interested in, we do see some traction on that model, which is where providers will buy the bus and rent the battery.
In this whole going green issue, obviously, granted, it saves our planet and it saves our pockets as well. And in the long term, it will produce a lot of savings. But in the short term, it is quite expensive to make this change. And it is quite, for people in the developed world and for people in the less developed countries, it's near impossible.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, an electric vehicle is more expensive to buy than a traditional vehicle. It's expensive for the car companies because the margin on electric vehicles is less than zero. And it's expensive for governments because they have to make incentives and put down the infrastructure. So this is not something that is, let's say, consumer and business driven in the first instance. It's there because we need to save the planet. It's there because there's a huge climate crisis, and you have to do it if you want a future. If you want a future for humanity, you have to take carbon out of the way that we live, and therefore I think governments see it as mandatory.
Andy, thank you. Before I let you go, I have to ask you this question that's been on my mind. You led Aston Martin for a while, and it's very easy to get very excited about Aston Martin, very passionate about an Aston Martin. We all do. How do you get excited about a bus now at Switch?
They're different vehicles, that's for sure. In setting up Switch, Switch is basically formed out of the old UK company called Optare and the electric division of Ashok Leyland brought together in one company. We've been able to set out a purpose, and the purpose is very simple. It's the democratization of net zero carbon. And I think that we're the first automotive company that is basically net zero carbon today. And to me, that ability to lead, you know, Aston was about leadership in beauty. Switch is about leadership in and driving towards net zero carbon and proving it can be done. And that's something that's, let's say, really important for humanity. And that's something I can get passionate about.